Good evening all, and welcome. Before the video begins, I just want to give a very special happy birthday shout out to Liam. I hope that you have had an amazing day. And a shout out to you too, Tara, wishing you two all the best. But anyway, without further ado, it's time to get comfortable as we go exploring cabins in the woods. It's time to let the darkness take control. We have a family cabin in the middle of nowhere, on a small lake with two other cabins surrounded by forested area and flat lands. About 2 miles away from the cabin, and across the dirt road, is a wildlife reserve. As kids, we walked through there all the time, and had the opposite of helicopter parents. After about 30 minutes of walking straight into these woods, there used to be a collection of abandoned houses, an old settlement, and we went exploring and found that the people who lived there had just up and left. In each house, there were still dishes on the table, clothing in the closets, and cars parked in the clearings. All the strappings for horses in the barns, and in one house, the floor had caved in, and there were about 40 pairs of women's shoes scattered around the hole in the middle. No bones though. Animal or human. Nothing. We decided to stay away from the second floor of the houses after we saw that. We figured that they'd be structurally unsound. A skeletal treehouse in the middle of the clearing. And after we told my parents, my dad wanted to come and look at it. In one of the houses we found a bedroom, fully intact. The sheets were still on the bed, the pillow still had the indentation of a head on it. But everything was covered in a thick layer of dirt and dust on the floors, and they had only our footprints in them. At the foot of the bed was this stunning enormous grey fur coat. There were a few moth holes chewed in it, and it was dirty as everything else was. But when we expected it, we knew it was real fur, likely wolf or silver fox. It was gorgeous. Dad decided he was going to bring it back and clean it up and see if he could have it remade for my mum, as my dad was a thrifty guy. As we were leaving, I got a chill on the back of my neck, and about 60 yards from the house, turned around and saw an old woman glaring at us from the windows of the second floor. She had her hair in a loose bun and was wearing a blue shawl over her shoulders, over a cream-colored blouse. I immediately felt super guilty. I grabbed my dad, who was about 10 yards ahead of me, and told him we'd better put the coat back, because the woman was still living there, and we had obviously probably scared her, and she looked pissed. We turned back around and I pointed to the window that I saw her glaring at us from. There was no one there. I said she must have gone downstairs, and as we approached the house still carrying the stupid coat, one of the windows in another house suddenly slammed shut. I ran as fast as I could into the woods. Dad, being Dad, stayed behind and started yelling for the lady to come out and that he was sorry. He went upstairs and no one was there. Dust on the floor undisturbed. Then he smarted up and dropped the coat in a big hurry, and we beat it back to the road as fast as we could. About 5 years later, the government demolished the whole thing. My parents have owned a cabin in the woods for a many number of years. I have some great memories out there. We'd always go there when me and my siblings were children. But as my parents got older and we moved away, the cabin fell into disrepair, and no one wanted to go there anymore. I had moved away from my family home and was, fortunately, situated a lot closer to the cabin than where my parents still lived. They weren't in a great financial position and asked me, as I wasn't too far away, if I could go down and check out how the old girl was doing, see if it needed any repairs and check out the condition, because they were probably going to sell it. I mean, they'd had their fill of it. It was time to pass it on to someone new, if they would take it anyway. Now keep in mind, we hadn't been there in a while. I'm thinking at least 4 to 5 years at this point. And still that's just speculation, as my parents said that they let it out to a friend, but they were never sure if they made it or not. Regardless, my parents mail me the key, and within a few days I find myself with it, and head on over there on Friday night. I pack a few things, thinking that I'll probably stay there the night, and just have a little chill time before heading back in the morning, and making sure that everything works fine. So, after about 2 hours of driving, I make it into a quite secluded area deep in the woods. It all looks very familiar, although much of the surrounding area has become overgrown. As I get out of my car, I step up onto the porch of the cabin. It's fallen into disrepair, that's for sure. There are holes, the wood seems weaker, and there's this strange, funky smell that I can't quite put my finger on. I go to put the key into the lock and give it a hard twist. Just as I try and push the door open, I realize that the expanding wood has made this a challenge, so I have to really shove and hear the wood creak from the door and the floorboards as I make my way in. When I finally manage to open the door enough, I close the door and get out my flashlight to investigate. I then realize something is wrong. The house is full of plastic bags, newspapers, and general garbage. I was beyond confused, and then the smell hit me. My God, did it reek? I was absolutely in shock that I quickly opened the door and nearly gagged. It took me 20 minutes before I braved going in there again. I assumed that an animal must have found its way in and died, and that someone must either have been living here or still was living here, or just decided to store a whole load of crap. Either way, I wasn't sure. But what kind of person would want to stay here, so remote, unless they had some transportation? Which, judging by no vehicle being outside, I really doubted. Not to mention the lock on the door still worked fine. So, after thinking all this stuff through, I opened the door once more. It was just as challenging the second time, and as I braced my nose and got my flashlight ready, I started out the investigation. You come in through the hallway, and to your left you have a bedroom. I stuck my flashlight in there, and it was very clear that the mess still flowed into this room. I exited, turned left to continue down the hallway, and entered the main living area, a sort of open plan kitchen and dining room. And that is where I saw it. My parents had an old couch that they didn't use anymore and that was just sitting in our basement. So one year we brought it here, and here it stayed. But there was something on the couch. It was definitely a person, or a person at some point. It now just looked like melted sludge over bone, black and festering. I can't begin to describe just how repulsed I was by this horrific sight. I gagged there and then. I could not hold it in any longer, and my vomit exploded onto a wall and erupted over the plastic bags. I had to leave straight away. and tried calling the cops. But of course, there was no service. I drove for about 15 minutes until I found decent reception, and they called the EMS and police. They took my statement and made it very clear that the person was very dead, which is something I could have figured out by myself. Long story short, I ended up having to clean up most of the mess, but at least the human remains, if you can even call them that, were taken away. But my God, the stench permeated every bit of the wood. I never got much follow-up, and I don't know how long that body had been there, but long enough that it had absolutely destroyed the place. I ended up airing it for a week with no success. I bought fresheners and potpourri and those little liquid things with sticks that apparently make the house smell nice. Nothing worked. Once that smell permeates, it cannot be gotten rid of. I of course told my parents, who were beyond disappointed, and just thought that I would leave the windows open all year to see if that might do the trick. It's been about 4 months now, and I haven't gone back. But from all the pieces that I picked up once we cleared it up, it looks like it was some kind of homeless lady. She'd been living there for a few years and kept a tatty journal of what she did. Stuff like getting a lift into town or walking the 3 hours through the forest just to get back here. I'm not sure what she died of, but it's sad to think that she died alone, dark, in a cabin in the woods. Quite sad, really. My cousin and I drove up to my grandparents' cabin for a visit one weekend when I was 17. My grandparents' cabin is on a lake in way northern Minnesota. They live about an hour or two south of the Boundary Waters, so it's heavily forested and sparsely populated apart from the lake. My cousin and I were always running around outside. We'd go canoeing and explore islands that were around my grandparents' bay. We'd be swimming at the sandbar or hiking in the woods. When it came to the forest, I was always slightly uneasy. I was always warned about moose, bears, and wolves. So, we'd always stay within a mile of the house. I'd also become familiar with the Wendigo myth thanks to my grandma's Ojibwe co-worker, so that also played a role in my unease. The day before we were supposed to leave, my cousin and I decided to go four-wheeling. They only had one four-wheeler, so my cousin sat behind me while I drove, as I knew the area better. There are numerous four-wheeler trails all over the forest, but my cousin and I decided to explore an area that was going to be developed for houses. All that was there was a small road that led off the main dirt road. This small road came to a circular clearing that had two smaller paths off the opposite side, leading off going left and right. When we stopped at the edge of the clearing, I got the feeling of someone watching us from somewhere up ahead. I wrote it off as me just being paranoid, so I asked my cousin which way we should go. We decided to go left, so I reluctantly headed down the path. We were driving for about 2 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. We came across a fallen tree that was blocking the path. Relieved, we had to turn around, and it took a bit of maneuvering to get around, but when we finally did, I noticed two things that didn't seem right. The first thing is typically that you can hear the birds chirping or the sound of the wind in the trees, but the forest seemed quiet. Second, the air felt cooler. It was getting darker out, but even northern Minnesota in July is still pretty warm at night. but the air felt way colder than it should have been. We started to drive back, when my cousin shouted at me to drive faster. Freaked out, I gunned it. What I heard next sent chills down my spine. It was a blood-curdling scream. I can't find the words to accurately describe what it sounded like. The best I can do is a cross between a person in pain and an animal that is hurt and angry. The feeling of being watched got more intense over the next minute, but as soon as we sped across from the clearing, everything returned to normal. The forest sounds came back, the air felt right again, but I still felt like we were being watched. So I gunned it back to my grandparents' cabin, where we turned the corner to get to the main road from the edge of the clearing. And I swear to God, I saw an unnaturally tall, shadowy figure standing close to the edge of the forest. I spent the rest of the 20-minute drive back, constantly looking over my shoulder to make sure that the shadowy thing wasn't following us. My cousin and I have never even spoken about the incident after it happened, but we stopped hiking in the forest and exploring the wooded islands after that. My girlfriend's cabin has been in her family since she was born. One night, it was just me and her out there. The cabin was off of the ground, about 5 feet give or take a foot, and there was a deck surrounding the cabin that was raised. Plenty of space on the deck for a barbecue, table, and chairs. Before we headed out to bed, I specifically remember moving the 4 metal, pretty heavy, chairs up to the outside of the cabin by the front, up against the wall of the deck. They were 4 to 5 feet away from the edge of the deck, the furthest they could be. It was not on a windy night, and no one was around apart from my girlfriend and I, and we went to bed like any other night. We woke up next morning and went out for a smoke and found something that made me freeze. I saw one of the chairs had fallen off the deck, but wait, it was 6 to 8 feet away from the cabin standing up normally. So all in all, it managed to move across the deck 5 foot wide and then fall 5 foot and managed to land standing up and then move across the grass another 6 to 8 feet. There was just no way one of those chairs could fall that way, even if it was the windiest night. Just not going to happen. Also, it was now facing the pond on the other side of the cabin. When I put it on the deck, it was facing the other way. So somehow, without wind or anyone else on the property, this heavyish chair was now in a completely different spot. I spent the morning pushing chairs from the edge of the deck, trying to recreate it, but there was just no way. They would never land standing up. It was only this one chair. The others were where I left them. I told my girlfriend and she believed it was her mother, who had passed away the year before. She loved the family cabin and spent every summer out there. I'm pretty sure the pond was her project. I'm the kind of guy who looks for logic, but I couldn't see how this chair moved this way. Their cabin is now gone, as it was lost in a flood. But we still have those chairs on our current balcony, and I've never even seen them move an inch due to the wind. And there's no wind protection where we are. We have a family cabin near Sandpoint, Idaho. I've been spending summers there with my husband for nearly 20 years now. We go up there almost every weekend, sometimes staying weeks at a time. Being in the woods and near the lake, I'm not a stranger to animals. I also grew up in the rural Midwest in the woods, so I'm comfortable and not easily spooked by the woods at night. Last year, we went for our usual weekend visit. I remember getting to the cabin and finding out my husband forgot and left my hiking boots on the porch of our home, and I was really pissed off, since I had planned to spend the weekend hiking. All I had to wear the entire weekend was a pair of cheap sandals. That night, we got the kids tucked into bed and we folded out the sofa sleeper, where we slept. My husband fell asleep, but I had a new book that I was reading, so I decided to stay up and read it. It was around 1 in the morning when I heard what can only be described as screams. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door and peeked my head out so that I could tell where the sound was coming from, and it was from just beyond our cabin. It was a new moon, and I couldn't see anything, but it was almost 20 feet from our cabin, just beyond the chain-link fence that divides our property from another. It was the sound of an animal being attacked. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I held my breath. It was a coyote, and it was straight up being killed. There was no struggle, and that is what stood out to me. No rustling of grass or trees or leaves, no growling or snapping, only the sounds of a coyote screaming and dying. It went on for enough that I thought it stuck in a trap, and I was debating on walking to the fenced area to see if I could help. But all I had were these stupid sandals. And there was no way I was fumbling around in the dark in the woods with sandals. Slowly, it finally died, and everything was quiet. I felt sick to my stomach, because I've never heard an animal suffer like that. And then I heard it. Something was on my property. Something jumped our fence without a sound and was slowly walking around the property line. It was completely silent, but its footsteps were there and clearly bipedal. It was like the most graceful human walking, and I couldn't see a damn thing because it was pitch black. There's no way a human could walk the woods of our property with no moon out and no flashlight, and not trip over or fall over stumps or bushes. It didn't move fast, and seemed to stop for a moment, maybe spotting me on the porch, and then quietly walked off. If you grew up in the woods, you know the sound of animal versus human walking in the woods. 2 feet versus 4 makes a big difference. I was trying so hard to convince myself that maybe it was a coyote, and that maybe it got away, and maybe it was stuck in a trap. I asked the neighbors about traps, and they were 100% against them, and said that they knew our family was in the dog business and would never put traps out, since we would often have our dogs with us. I don't know what killed that coyote. I am a 16-year-old male, and I have family down in Alabama. They own a huge amount of land down in Huntsville, and a very nice big farm. My uncle owns a big house and a bunch of trailers that they put out in the woods for hunting and camping. My cousins suggest that we use this space to go camp out. Now I'm a kid from Chicago, so they tease the hell out of me, collect food, kill a pig and some chickens, and bring necessities to camp out for a few days. We get to the camp, and it's obvious something is weird. The air has this strange electric smell, like right before a storm, like ozone. We think nothing of it, and unpack and go down to a little creek to swim for a few hours. All of a sudden, some older white guy and a white teenager come out of the bushes. He has a shotgun in the crook of his arm, and says hello, and asks us what we're doing this far in the woods. I tell him about my uncle who he knows, and say we're camping out. He tells us that we need to be really careful out there, and stick together, that there was a big animal in the woods. His son, who is my age, asks if he can hang out with us. He says okay, so we end up playing football. Dicking around with me, there's the white kid, Tanner, 5 of my cousins, we're all black, and then 4 of their friends. In total, there were 5 girls and 6 boys. We were all aged 15 to 17. We ended up just sticking the day away. So we head back to the camp and pull out some stuff for a campfire, even though the trailers both had kitchenettes. Tanner says that his family's property sits up against my uncle's. He wants to run home and ask his dad if he can go out camping with us. My cousin Rooster says he's going to go with him since it's going to get dark soon. One of the girls also wanted to tag along. It's about 7, and it's starting to get pretty dark. They take a flashlight and take the trail towards Tan's property. The rest of us chill. We make s'mores, drink, and kiss on the girls. About 30 to 40 minutes later, there's the smell of ozone again. You could smell it over the smell of fire that we'd started. This really nasty coppery smell, like after you've had a nosebleed and it's stopped. It wasn't exactly like dry blood, but it was that nasty metallic back of your throat smell. We immediately think that it's some kind of electrical malfunction, or someone left a hot plate on or some shit. We search the trailers, and nothing is on. And we can all smell it. All of a sudden, we can hear people booking it down the path towards us. And Rooster, Tan, and the girl all come running into the clearing and out of breath. And they don't even break a stride. They run into the trailer, right by where the fire is. We all get the hell out of there and go into the trailers. They end up calming down, and even Rooster is crying his eyes out at this point. All the while, the fire is guttering lower and lower. So my other cousins say screw it, and are about to go outside to get the generators out of a shed between the trailers. Tanner goes, "No, lock the door. Ain't nobody else going outside." He's been crying too, and his eyes are bloodshot and puffy, and his pants are dirty as shit. He goes on to tell us that they went up to his house. His father said sure that he could go camping, but to make sure they were careful on their way back, and that maybe they should take one of the hunting rifles just in case. Evidently, Tanner had seen something in their yard a few days before. One of their pigs had come up, ripped up, and half eaten. They assumed it was just some big cats or coyotes, even though they didn't usually mess with live animals. He'd gone upstairs and packed his stuff, and told his dad that they would be okay without the rifle because coyotes avoid people. So they started walking back towards where we were camping. So Rooster finally stops crying and shaking. The girl already had, but she was just staring out the window with a dumb look on her face. He said they'd gotten halfway into the woods towards the camp when they started to hear shit in the forest. It was almost pitch black at this point, so they weren't sure what the hell it was. The girl says that she heard something in the bushes right off the trail, and they all beamed their flashlights over there, and there was someone standing a bit back in the woods in a little hollow. Rooster said they shouted at him and told him that he was scaring the hell out of them, and what a dick he was. He says that's when he realized that the guy was facing away from them. So they kept walking, and they started smelling the nasty coppery ozone smell. They say that they look off into the forest on the opposite side, and it's a dude standing in the forest, backwards, slightly closer to the path. So now they start power walking, and Tan keeps going. I should have taken my rifle. As they're telling the story, the smell is still super strong even inside the cabin. They say that after they started walking faster, a kind of low gibbering had started coming from both sides of the woods. and as they started booking it back to the trailer, the girl said she had flashed her flashlight out into the woods to the side of them and had seen something jerking itself through the woods. The gibbering just got louder and louder, and when they could see the light from our campfire, something had come out of the woods about 40 yards from behind them onto the track, and they had just flat out ran as hard as they could onto the trailer. So we're out in the woods, and we're assuming at this point it's some rednecks or some shit trying to screw with us. All of a sudden, my other cousin, Junior, started going on about how he went to school with a native kid that was telling him about the goat man or some shit. We promptly tell him to shut the hell up, because we don't need any spooky talk right now. But he keeps going on about how it's the goat man and how we're in his woods. Now at the time I'd never heard of the goat man or anything like that. But then, a couple of years ago, the year before I graduated college, I had a minom for a roommate, and I ended up asking him about it. And to sum it up, it's basically a man with the head of a goat, and he can shapeshift, and he gets among groups of people to terrorize them. It was also supposed to be kind of like the Wendigo, and it's even bad mojo to talk about it, and worse to see it. Keep in mind, I didn't know this back when I was 16, so my cousin is going, the goat man is going to get us. The girls are all terrified, and my cousin and I are all trying to figure out if it's just some hillbillies or some animal. So all of a sudden, the smell goes away. Like, to this day, I haven't even experienced anything like it. Usually a smell will fade or lessen. It was just literally there 1 second, and then not the next. So it's about after an hour, making it roughly 9 or 10. We've stopped shitting bricks enough to go back outside and stoke the fire once more. We figured it was just some assholes trying to mess with us. So we didn't go back home, because we think, if we do, they'll chase us through the woods or some crazy shit. Nothing else weird happens that night, and we stay another night, and for the main part of the night, nothing happens. At about 1 in the morning, we're outside getting drunk and telling ghost stories. As someone was finishing some spooky stories, the smell comes back. It's so strong that one of the girls literally starts vomiting. I stand up, and you can actually feel how clammy the air is. I say that we should get inside, and that this isn't right, and that we should have just left. We all go back inside, and we're standing around. My cousin just keeps going on about how it's the goat man, and my cousin Rooster tries to shut him up. All the while, I'm just feeling like there's something wrong, and I can't figure out what it is. We end up sitting in there for a while. The smell is just as strong, and we're terrified and all huddled in this little camper. We end up cooking brats for everyone, because nobody wants to go outside. It's one of those packs of 4 brats. We have a total of 3 packs. I grill them up on the stove and give everyone a hot dog. I get mine, and after a while one of my cousins gets up and goes over to the pot to get another one. He starts grumbling about how I get 2 brats and everyone else only got 1, and I look at him as if he's stupid. I tell him that everyone only got 1 because there were only 12. If he wants more, he should open a new pack and cook some. That's when the girl that had been out with Rooster and Tan starts screaming, "Oh Jesus, oh Lord, get it out." She's crying and shivering. And then it dawns on the cousin standing up, what the hell is wrong? Me and him both glance around the room. and then I feel my heart sink. I run the hell out of the cabin, and the girl runs out with me. The trailer door is banging against the side of the trailer as everyone books it out of the cabin. One of my cousin's friends asks us what's wrong. I start counting. There is only 11 of us now. I shit you not, my cousin verified. There had been 12 people in the cabin, but being that everyone didn't really know each other that well, nobody had really noticed the whole time that there was an extra person. And then I realized earlier that I had kind of noticed something was off. You know how when you're just sticking around having a good time, that you don't sweat the smallest shit, and that you don't always keep track of certain stuff? I'm dead sure that someone else had been in the trailer with us, and that they had been there for at least a day eating with us. What makes it worse, I couldn't figure out which one, because I didn't think anyone was ever actually interacting with the other person, / the goat man. The girl kept praying to Jesus, and we're all sitting outside. Eventually, we get big-ass sticks and go back into the cabin. There's nobody there. We count again, and there's 11 people. We go back into the trailer and lock the door, and we explain what the hell just happened, and the girl said that she realized it too, and that when he was about to say something, the person sitting next to her grabbed her leg and leaned over towards her and said something that she couldn't understand. So we are pretty much scared as hell right now, huddled together, and I fall asleep. When I wake up, the sun is just coming up, and half of the people are asleep. The other half are packing our shit up. We all want to just go home, but it's about 4, and people want to stay until the sun is all the way up in the sky. Some people think that we're just screwing around and still want to stay in the trailers. I just want to get the hell out of the woods. The girl's name was Kira, the one that the goat man had touched. Anyway, I asked her if she really thinks it was something bad, and she just said that she wanted to go home, and that she didn't want to be out in the woods alone for another night. So we decided to split up. The 4 that wanted to go back could go, but I had to stay, because I have the keys to the cabin, and it was my uncle's and I have to lock up. I'm super pissed at this point, because I feel like people aren't taking this shit seriously, and I definitely didn't want to be out in the woods for another night. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince the rest of the people, now 4 guys and girls, to get the hell out of Dodge. Tanner leaves with them to go get a rifle, and says that he'll be back. So now there's only 7 of us left by 4 p.m. At around 5 he hasn't returned, and we're getting extremely antsy. And the only reason I stopped begging them to go back was because he went to get a gun. It's 5:30 p.m. or so, when the one cousin that did stay says that the girl Kira is outside. We all look outside, and sure enough, she's standing by the fire pit, with her back to the cabin. I'm thinking to myself, if she was so scared, why the hell would she return? And then I get this nasty feeling in my gut. Keep in mind, the whole time, the coppery smell had been gone. Now I realize I can smell just a twinge of it. I say this to the rest of them, and everybody, and these are the people that wanted to stay in the woods after we had the goddamn goat man in our midst, is laughing at me, and asking if I set this up to scare them. I'm looking at them like, I'm not just bullshitting you all right now, and I ask them why the hell I would play like that. So one of the girls goes outside to get Kira. She gets halfway to her and stops cold. Kira starts heaving. I don't know how the hell to describe it. Sort of like if someone with their back turned was laughing, without actually making any sound. It was this fact that made me realize there was not a single sound in the whole woods. It was dead silent. This was late in September, so it was still fairly hot at the time, but it was super chilly some days too. And you could usually hear big-ass geese honking or some kind of birds or squirrels chattering. So I step out of the door and tell her to come back into the trailer right now. She backs up and we lock the doors. We pull down all the shades except one and put a guy there in a chair to watch her. She stands there for another 20 minutes or so. The guy turns to say that she's still there, and there's a huge banging on the door. We all jump the hell up and scramble around the living room of the trailer. The banging is super loud. So now my cousin is holding one of the girls, and the other two are kind of giggling with nervous laughter, and me and the other two guys are shitting bricks. Then we hear Tan. He is screaming, "Let me in! Stop playing!" So we go over to the door and open it. He stumbles in with a rifle. There's nobody else outside. Evidently, he had walked up to the campsite. Nothing weird happened in the forest, but he had seen a girl. Mind you, he said it was not Kira standing there. When he had gotten to the edge of the clearing, she had turned towards him with a slack-jawed look and just stared him down, slowly tracking him as he walked around the outside of the clearing towards the camp. He said it wasn't until he was almost halfway to the trail that he had even realized that she was getting closer. She had started off by the fire, and without him even seeing her move, she had been turning, inching closer. He said he just ran the rest of the way back to the cabin, thinking it would open, and when he got to the door and it was locked, he turned, and it was about half the distance to the door. He looks around the room, and then gets super pale. He pulls me to the side and whispers in my ear, "You know, there are only 7 of us here, right?" I get that feeling where your stomach drops to your nuts. It had been back inside the trailer while we were all sorting out who was going where. And then, when we all went outside to talk earlier in the day, it had just slipped back in. We looked out the window, and there was nobody out there now. So we recounted everyone, and then basically I go over and ask everyone how many people were here, and everybody says 8. I say, "Well, how many are there now?" They all do the count, and realize there are only 7 people in the cabin. So Tan had brought back a couple of boxes of ammo and his rifle, and he had told his dad that there was some kind of animal in the forest, because he didn't think his dad would believe him if he said it was the goat man. He says that his cousin is supposed to be coming down in a few hours, and that in the morning we can all go back to his place and his cousin will drive us home. Now I'm really terrified. I at least feel better, because we can be American and shoot the hell out of whatever it is if it comes back. But then my cousin gets into this huge argument with one of the girls, because she thinks that I'm trying to be funny and pull a prank, and that she is getting really scared, and that it isn't funny. He keeps telling her I'm not that kind of person, and she says, "Well, how do we know the girl just wasn't Tanner in a wig? Or if it was really the goat man? How do we know that this is the real Tanner, and that the goat man didn't just kill Tanner in the woods and take his gun?" So, we get into a huge argument about this, where me and Tanner we could seriously be in danger, because at the very least, someone has been sneaking themselves into our trailer without us knowing and mingling with us. At the worst, Something bad is in the forest, with us. One of the girls is crying and saying she wants to go right now. And we're trying to tell her we shouldn't, because none of us are walking through the woods in the middle of the night. At this point, the sun is starting to go down, and it's a little bit cloudy out. We eat something and turn on the radio for a while, but we can't really get a station out. There wasn't anything decent. We turn it off, and about that time, Tan's cousin shows up. I think he was 19. At this point, the sun is barely over the horizon, and he has one of those heavy-duty lantern flashlights and another rifle. He walks up to the trailer, and we whisper to Tan, asking if he's sure that is his cousin, and he says yes. The guy looks behind him and all around camp and walks in. He kind of glances at us and says that we all look a little bit confused. He says, "Where's your other little buddy at? I figured she would meet up with us at the cabin. Is she a little slow or something?" He also asked whether we had been cooking blood in the cabin, because it smelt like blood, and hot pans all the way up the trail. We are now like, nope, but we ask him what the hell he's talking about with the girl he saw. He had come down the same trail Tan had been using, and he'd seen one of our buddies standing in the middle of the trail, looking at him slack-jawed. He'd asked her a bunch of questions, but all she did was look at him. Then she smiled at him, and he said he kept walking. She couldn't seem to keep up with him, and kept lagging a little behind. He asked if she was hurt, and if she needed any help. But she had continued to stare. Eventually, he'd been walking, and turned around a bend in the trail. But when he turned around to see if she was okay, the trail was empty. He'd assumed she'd taken a shortcut of some kind, and had already arrived. We tell him the whole story of what had been going on. I half expected him to say that we were full of shit, but he just listened, and then sat down on the couches in the living room. Tanner's cousin gets back to the girl. He says that when she had been trying to lag behind him, it had kind of weirded him out, so he tried to keep her in front of him, but no matter how slow he walked, she always lagged a little behind, and that he smelled this nasty smell, and it grew stronger when they got to camp. Eventually it got really strong. She had said something in a really low voice that he didn't catch, and when he turned around, she had sneaked right up on him, and he stepped back away from her. It was at this point he asked if she was okay, and if she wasn't, he would carry her back the rest of the way, and she just kept staring. He said he reached out for her and tried to grab her shoulder, but he must have misjudged the distance, because she was off to the side where he had put his hand, like she had moved whilst he was looking dead at her. So at this point we know that this shit is real, unless Tan is playing a most cruel joke, which we can tell he isn't, because he's almost pissing his pants. So they load up the rifle, we eat some more, and we just kind of sit around until 11. To this day, every time I think about this, I really pray to God that it's some huge prank, some huge elaborate construction that my cousins pulled on me, and just never revealed, so that I would shit myself for the rest of my life. At around 11, the stink of copper turns into an actual nasty, gross blood-like smell, like cooking blood and singed hair. Tan and his cousin Reese get the hell up instantly and grab the rifles. There is a half knocking, half clawing sound at the door. I shit you not. There's a voice, and it sounds like when you see those YouTube cats and dogs whose owners teach them how to talk. It says in this halting, weirdly toned voice, "Let me in. Stop playing." It made my nuts creep against my body, and one of the girls starts crying and calling out to Jesus. It was so obviously not a person talking. It didn't have the right cadence. And that's some shit I never realized until that moment. But all people have a certain cadence when they talk, no matter the language. All people have a kind of rhythm to talking. This shit didn't have any of that. One of those YouTube cats. That's what it sounded like. So now I'm in full terror mode. We keep yelling outside, "Who is it? Stop screwing around, man." And it just keeps saying, "In," or "Let me in, guys," for almost 15 minutes. So then the smell goes away for a while, and for the next hour or so, you can hear someone basically creeping around the woods. Every few minutes, it'll come back to the door and say something. Finally, when the smell fades away, it's around 2 in the morning. Reese says, "Screw this man," and opens the door with his rifle. He fires a shot into the air and says something to the effect of, "In the name of Jesus Christ, go away." He fires twice more, and then from the woods, right up against the river across from the trail, it sounds like something is slowly gibbering and hooting. Then it starts screaming, and it sounds almost like a woman and a cat in a bag screaming together. Like I seriously have never heard any shit like that. And you can hear the brush over that way start to shake. Reese fires over the tree line, and then starts backing into the house. We lock the door, and we can hear this shit keening and screaming. Reese says that something had come out of the bushes, super low to the ground, crawling towards the cabin, and he had a shot at it. Pretty much, that was how the rest of the night went. It was literally screaming constantly for the next 2 hours, and we could hear shit moving around out of the tree line, but it never came back up to the cabin until everyone had fallen asleep. Tan had been sitting in the chair watching the doors with his rifle. Nobody else heard or saw this, and he told me 2 days later after the whole thing was over. He said that he had been nodding off after the screaming and noises finally stopped, and that he'd almost been asleep when he saw someone come out of the bathroom and then lay down in the middle of the floor and go to sleep. He assumed it was one of us and had just nodded off. And he had nodded off. Then he said he kind of realized something was wrong, and while pretending to be asleep, he counted us. There were 9 people in the cabin. He basically didn't want to try shooting at the thing in the cabin and have it kill us, or have Reese wake up and start shooting at it and we kill ourselves, so we just stayed awake all night pretending to be asleep. He said sometimes it would stand up and kind of do this weird little jittery thing, or heave like it was laughing, but then it would lay back down. This story closes pretty weak, because from my perspective nothing happened. We woke up, and I noticed that Tam was a little jittery, and that he was avoiding looking at all of us. But we had some breakfast, packed up and started walking to his house. He stayed last in the cabin, and said that he'd lock up and bring me my uncle's keys, to just start walking, and that he would catch up, which I really didn't want to do. We got a little bit up the path, and when he came running up, basically we jogged back to his house. His cousin took us home. There was a window in the bathroom. Tan had gone back to lock up, and looked up in there, and we were too stupid to lock a screenless window. The window was open when he went in there. I'm guessing it had been doing this all along, waiting for us to fall asleep or slip up, and then to appear among us. It walked with us all the goddamn way back to his house, and then he said it lagged to the back of the group and looked him dead in the eyes before walking into the woods. I've always had a sixth sense for being watched. My brother and I grew up scaring each other, so I'm sure it was conditioned. I can't sleep with pets in the room, particularly dogs, because I wake up frequently to a pair of observing eyes. I was 12 and at Camp Old Indian, a Boy Scout camp in upstate Southern Carolina. My troop camped on the rim of the giant property in an open-sided cabin. After a long day working on a few water-related bridges, we were tired, so I subtly climbed into my sleeping bag and passed out. After a couple of hours of sleep, I wake up with an odd feeling. It's a particularly quiet night, something that unnerves me in the forest. You can hear every little twig crack. I love the gentle sound of the wind in the leaves. The moon is full and beams softly through the canopy. My gaze slowly tracks the beams of light to the forest floor and meets two yellow eyes. My heart skips a beat. In this remote region of the state, you find anything from possums to bears and mountain lions. Most prey animals have eyes set laterally. What I'm staring at is the eyes of a predator. They are calculating, evaluating eyes. As we maintain eye contact, I hear the rustling of leaves all around the cabin. Soon, more pairs of eyes are staring at me. I count at least 8 shadowy figures not 15 feet away. They're wolves. Wolves can smell fear and distress. We maintain eye contact for what feels like a year. Then one by one, they turn away and disappear into the foliage. Everyone else is sound asleep, but it took me a solid 2 hours of paranoia to pass out again. There was nothing preventing the pack from killing us in our sleep, but they just left. It was a surreal experience. I've been homeless. A lot. I lived in some distant family's land where they have an old cabin that's up on stilts, due to their local woods flooding heavily. Illinois is weird. Anyway, I spent a good amount of time in this old cabin. Wood stove, porch swing, hanging from the ceiling that I used as a bed. Overall, it was an okay place, and it wasn't too far of a drive to town for food. You just had to tolerate the half-mile walk to your car. One day, I'm out and walking about in the woods, in a smallish clearing of the path, and I see a good 50 to 60 dead geese. Every one of them is mangled in a horrific way. Necks ripped off the body. Bodies splayed out over one of the timbers and fence posts, and feathers are everywhere. Bones sticking out of the dirt. It just looked like a straight-up goose genocide. The ground was dry, and there was a lot of dust, but I saw no prints, and there was no evidence of anything being in the area, aside from what can only assume is some sort of strange breed of exploding goose. I also found a torn-up old backpack and a great deal of candy wrappers strewn about. Way too moldy to identify anything about it, and I decided to turn back and see if I could grab a camera when I started hearing this god-awful shrieking noise, as if it were coming from every possible nook and cranny within a 30-foot radius. I took off pretty fast when it started, and to this day, my best guess is some sort of massive commune of foxes. It really is the only rational solution I can come to, and it still scared the shit out of me. I lived on the outskirts of a national park in a cabin. It was a 4-mile drive from the main road just to get to the property, and we had no plumbing or power. This property was right next to where the park started. To call it the middle of nowhere is an understatement. My roommate at the time was interning with the park service, but he is a city kid. Every evening at the dead of night, I had been hearing noises in the woods. What I thought was someone walking, but it would just then stop in a particularly overgrown area of the jungle. So, your mind starts to doubt itself. Is it a pig? A cat? The wind? The cabin didn't have a locking door, and the owners didn't want me to install one, so I began sleeping in my car. Now this is a huge property, and I parked my car over an acre away from the cabin, and where I was hearing something. I started hearing those footsteps again. I moved out. My roommate, who I thought was bonkers, stayed there and slept there without a locking door. He got robbed, not once, but twice after I moved out. So he finally put up motion trigger cameras. There was a man with a long rifle who'd hike up to his property, set up in the bushes, and watch us. I guess it was the cause of a creepy hotel story. We had a class trip where the hotel we were staying at was actually a small collection of cabins in a woody/grassy area. Apparently, a great majority of my classmates had agreed to go on a run to a convenience store one evening, but there were maybe 6 or 7 of us who were unaware of the plans. So suddenly, from our perspective, everyone was suddenly gone and we were alone. We were going around looking for people and had split up. I went to my cabin, which had a balcony on it, and decided to try and survey the area to see if I could spot a teacher or one of the staff there. I saw my friends on the ground and waved at them to say hi, just to let them know where I was. What I didn't realize was that I had just washed my hair, so it was long, dark, and hanging down and kind of stringy looking, and I was wearing a white nightgown. And from the perspective of my friends on the ground, I was backlit by the light coming from inside my room, so picture a Ring-esque girl waving down a group of preteens in the woods who suddenly think that everyone has vanished.